Okay, perfect. So we'll go ahead and start our presentation, which is on the Liliaceae family. Okay. So with the Liliaceae family, uh, or the lily family, this is kind of an interesting group because as it stands right now, it's really not a very large group anymore. And this is really opposite of how it's been previously. So the Liliaceae family used to be kind of this plant group that just got so many different genera and species just got lumped into this group just because really botanists may not have known exactly at the time, where to place some of these plants. But now, since we are in the age of DNA testing, we've really come a long way from just examining, the flowers themselves with helping to group where these plants belong. And so a lot of plants have actually come out of this group. And as of right now, we're left with only about 16 genera left. And so just to kind of, put it into perspective here, a lot of plants that were lumped into this group have moved to new families, most commonly the Amaryllidaceae family or the um, uh, um, Asparagaceae family, and even the Asphodel family. All of them, a lot of the plants have moved into those kind of three groupings, it seems, from Liliaceae family. And so plants that used to be in the Liliaceae family, a lot of your bulb type plants have moved on. And so again, this is kind of a smaller group as a result. Now, don't be confused because depending on what website or source you're using, if you're looking up a specific plant species, it may still have it grouped in the Liliaceae family when actually it has since been moved to a new group. So just kind of make sure you're doing your due diligence with that because the within the last several years, there has been a lot of changeover with the ability to do a lot of DNA testing. So what remains in this group? Well, like I said, it's pretty small. I mean, especially when we had talked about previously with the Lamiaceae and the Asteraceae family, and even the legume family, all of them were very large families. So this is very much narrowed down. But what remains are primarily herbaceous plants and a few shrubs found in temperate and subtropical regions. A lot of the plants we're going to talk about are kind of more of your temperate plants. What are some common characteristics with them? Well, a lot of them have parallel leaves, and we'll kind of talk about that in the next few slides. This is a plant family of monocots, and so there are some similarities there with how their kind of different structure and tissue is arranged. Oftentimes, they have more of an alternate or whorled leaf arrangement, and most of the time, the flowers are six segmented. Primarily, they're tepals. So a tepal is basically there's kind of no distinction between a petal or a sepal. So we kind of call it a tepal. You can't really break down what is a petal versus what is a sepal in this plant group. Now, there are some slight differences depending on the species, but for the most part, these plants have six tepals. And then, of course, these flowers give way to these kind of capsule-shaped fruit that are three-chambered. Probably the most common thing, though, that we're going to talk about, especially in the next slide, is these are a bulbous plant family. So a lot of these members of the family have these underground storage organs called bulbs. And then finally, what is this family? kind of noted for primarily ornamental purposes, if we're being honest. Doesn't have a whole lot in the way of like medicinal or used as food crops, although there are some that are edible and used in different cuisines. But primarily for the purposes of the economy now, it's going to be used for ornamental. So as your typical kind of garden bed, flowering plants. So let's kind of talk about bulbs real quick. And, you know, we classify a lot of things into bulbs when they may not actually be true bulbs. So there are different underground storage structures like corms and tubers and tuberous roots. But when we get down into it with this family, we'll talk about bulbs that um, really a true bulb is this kind of flattened stem, and it's surrounded by these fleshy leaf bases called scales. And depending on the type of bulb, it could be tunicate versus non-tunicate. And basically, what that is those scales may be covered with this papery outer layer that's more protective, or they just may look more scaly and naked. So, especially since we're talking about this family, the Liliaceae family, tulips, for instance, are going to be tunicate, whereas your lilies are going to be more scaly, non-tunicate. Now, I did go ahead and mention onions and daffodils. They are true bulbs as well, but they have moved on into a different family, the Amaryllidaceae family. So this is going back to old school textbook biology, um, is the difference between monocot versus dicot, right? Or now you typically we say monocot versus eudicot, although there are still some dicots out there. Um, but with this family being monocots, that means that they only have one cotyledon from the seed, whereas your eudicots or dicots have two. The Whenever you look at the different types of tissues within the plant, the root, xylem, and phloem, they're arranged differently. The vascular bundles are arranged differently. But primarily what you all are going to be looking at are the leaves and flowers. And especially for monocots, typically the leaves have veins that are in a parallel pattern. So that's going to be kind of the most common characteristic that you see there. And then also more characteristic of monocots is their flower parts are usually in threes or multiples of three. And so I had just mentioned in the previous slide that they have six tepals. So that's going into a multiple of three. Whereas your dicots, your eudicots have their flower parts in multiples of four or fives. Okay, so that's kind of like a brief breakdown of some characteristics with this family. So let's talk about a few members of this family. So I think the obvious is this is the lily family. So let's talk about lilies, which we're going to talk about the genus Lilium. So with these lilies, they're herbaceous perennials found in kind of more temperate regions of the globe from North America, Europe, and Asia. These are what we call bulbous geophytes. Rock loving is what geophyte means. And the bulbs themselves are again, traditionally non-tunicate, scaly in nature, and depending on the species, may be yellow, white, or purplish in coloration. Oftentimes with these plants, they're usually kind of more of an erect, upright plant. Rarely does it kind of branch out. And then the leaves themselves are going to be kind of more sessile. They'll have more of a either whorled or alternate leaf arrangement all around the stem, and their shape is anywhere from linear to elliptic. So you kind of can see some similarities there between the different species of lilies. Um, of course, they produce oftentimes very fragrant, very showy flowers. Again, this is our stereotypical kind of six tepaled flower structure. And they do produce these significant anthers here, and that pollen um, can be very colorful, but also you might need to watch because it almost acts as a natural dye, and so that can kind of stain clothing. So just kind of watch it when you're handling lilies. And those of you who have lilies in your garden or you have them as cut flowers, you already know that. So with the lily genus, you're growing this mainly as an ornamental. You could use mass plantings to get kind of this really nice color impact, or you may have a single specimen that's kind of your prize specimen that you may use in judging at county, state fairs, or even more on a national level for lily judging. Um, and they, of course, make great cut flowers. Now, there is a lot of debate um, among lily enthusiasts, if you will, about how they should be grouped. And so sometimes the grouping can change just depending on who you talk to. And so this is kind of, more of a generalized grouping that I presented to you here. But you have your Asiatic lilies, you have your American lily, which we'll talk about an American lily actually in the next slide. Your longiflorum, of course, that's kind of more of your Easter lily, or what we call the Easter lily. And then you've got your trumpet, and then your Orient pet, which is kind of a hybrid. So, again, there's different groupings of lilies and how they are, and honestly, a lot of it comes down to how they've been hybridized, what's been bred with what. It may be hard to actually kind of figure out sometimes when there's been so much hybridization and cultivation, where to kind of lump some of these newer varieties of lilies. So I want to mention kind of one of our native lilies that we have, commonly called the Turk's cap lily. And these are a beauty. So these are a native wildflower and found in eastern North America. A lot of times, whenever you find these, especially in Kentucky, you're going to find them kind of in more wet areas along ravines, swamps, and then, out further east along coastal logs. So the plant itself um, has leaves that are whorled up on the stem, and they're kind of more elliptic to lance shape. But the reason, of course, people like them is because of the flower they produce, which is a very unique segmented flower that it produces this orangey red flower with kind of these blotches of purple on it. But what's unique is those tepals kind of recurve backward. They recurve backward and even sometimes to the extreme where those tips may actually touch. Um, and so that's kind of a unique feature compared to other lilies that you see. Now, these will produce off one stalk between 4 to 12 blooms. So there is a difference between that versus other species. Generally, these are kind of more of a looser cluster. And you're going to see these blooming a bit later. You're going to be seeing them bloom July and August. But this is a really great pollinator plant. It's going to attract your butterflies, bees, and hummingbirds. So if you see this out in the woodlands of Kentucky, then you're in for a real treat. And if you can get your hands on one that you can plant in your garden, kind of in a more kind of moist area, then they're very beautiful plants to have. Fritillary. So there's a few different types of fritillaries out there. Specifically, I'm talking about the snake's head fritillary. Um, The fritillaries are a pretty common bulb type plant that you can purchase different varieties at your local garden centers, especially when they have your bulbs available. This is not native to Kentucky. This is actually native in Europe, found kind of more in grassy floodplains and meadows. The foliage is really nothing to look at. It's kind of thin, strap-like, and kind of this gray-green coloration. Uh, what you really are looking at is you're looking at the beautiful bell-shaped flowers that are kind of more of this arching shape to them. And they're very showy. They have almost like this checker spot pattern on them, where it's kind of red or purple mixed with white. And so very kind of a unique structure that you don't see on a lot of blooms. Now, these are traditionally a little bit more solitary, but you may have a few varieties that may be able to produce more than one bloom per stalk. Now, what's interesting about this plant is when the flower is pollinated, the stem will actually straighten up a little bit, and it's going to allow those seed pods to be kind of held upright. And in these pods, they have kind of these little flat, dark colored triangular seeds. Um, so they're kind of fun to look at. I love anytime I see anything that's kind of more of a triangular seed. Now, um, over time, as we get into the later summer months, the foliage is going to die back, and the seed pods will kind of remain and ripen. So, this is kind of one to be enjoyed a little bit earlier in the season compared to others. So, like for instance, this is kind of a later blooming plant. Let's talk about the toad lily. This is a really great shade perennial. If you've got a really good shade garden and you're just really not sure what you want to plant, I absolutely love toad lilies. So there's a few different species of toad lilies. There's um, Tricertus hirta and Tricertus formosa. Um, they're native to parts of Asia, primarily Taiwan and the different Japanese islands. They are found there in kind of more shady rocky cliffs or along stream banks. Uh, they can spread a little bit in your garden, but I wouldn't call them so aggressive or invasive in nature that you would have to worry about it. But you have to give them space um, to kind of grow out. So don't plant them too closely to other shade plants. They have these creeping rhizomes and these clumps of green foliage. The foliage is really unique where it has kind of this alternate leaf arrangement that's ladder-like. Um, and depending on the species that you get, like Tricertus hirta, that is hairy, kind of has more of these hairy leaves and stems. But what you're growing this for is for the flowers, and the flowers are very unique. So they produce these very lovely star-like to even orchid-like flowers. Now they're tiny. When you see pictures of these flowers like up close or online, it doesn't really prepare you or give you an idea until you see them in person, just how small they can actually be. Um, but they produce clusters of these flowers. They kind of come up along the leaf axil, facing upward. And the flowers are often white to lavender in color with these adorable little purple speckles. And again, these are blooming kind of later in the summer to fall months. But if you look at them closely, they're a very unique looking flower, almost alien even, but very, very beautiful. And so that's why this makes a really great addition to have in your garden. Again, this is going to prefer more shade. It can tolerate some partial shade, but this is not a full sun plant. Do not plant these in full sun. It needs to be more shaded. But it serves as a great accent to some of your shade gardens. Now, even though this is not native, again, I don't worry about it to have any kind of really invasive tendencies. It is going to be attractive to pollinators in your garden. It's a great nectar source, especially for hummingbirds. So, um, definitely one that, I would have kind of as an essential plant in a shade garden. One of my favorite shade plants, I would say even. All right. We can't get into the Liliaceae family without talking about lilies, but also without not without talking about tulips, because this is quite a big member of this family. So of course, let's do a little bit more of a deep dive. These are a bulbous perennial. These are not native to the Americas. They're found more in Southern Europe to Central Asia, but these have been distributed worldwide just as a garden favorite. And we'll kind of talk about its history here in the next slide. Now, depending on the type of tulip you get, some of them have kind of more of that traditional strap-like, kind of paddle-shaped, silvery blue foliage, but then you have others that are a little bit more grass-like. Uh, Traditionally, these are going to bloom here in Kentucky, kind of more middle to late spring, depending on the cultivar that you have. And they come in about just every color you can imagine except blue. The flower shapes are going to vary depending on the cultivar as well. They may be more erect, they may be more cup shaped, bowl shaped, even star shaped. They may have ones that look a little bit more frilly than others. Um, but these have, again, still your traditional six tepals. Now, they're often kind of whorled in two worlds and often blotched. And if you ever look closely, um, kind of at the other reproductive parts, the anthers are mostly black, although sometimes you might get some varieties that have a yellow anther. But again, this is just years upon years of hybridization, cultivation, that it's hard to even say where the lineage of some of these plants come from. And so a lot of times you'll just see tulip hybrid. Now, with tulips, even though we consider them a perennial, sometimes they're kind of more treated as a short-lived perennial, although you do have some older cultivars that can last for 20 or more years. Just in general, though, tulips have a tendency to diminish over time. They may not perform as well after a few years. Sometimes even after the second or third year, their performance, flowering performance just goes downhill. And so a lot of times people, especially botanic gardens, they will go ahead and remove their tulips after 1 year. When we had gardens at Virginia Tech with our tulips, we replaced ours every 2 years. Um, just because after so long, sometimes tulips may not even bloom again for you. Maybe you only have the foliage that comes up the following year. And so you do have to put a little bit more effort into growing tulips just for the fact that you might have to be digging these up every year if you want to have a good kind of color splash in your garden. But not also to mention, which is kind of at the bottom here, prone to wildlife grazing. We have plenty of wildlife in Kentucky that will not only eat the foliage, but also even dig up and eat the bulbs themselves, so they can be prone to a lot of wildlife issues. So you have to do what you can to protect them, either keep them kind of caged or your area kind of fenced in, maybe even consider placing the bulbs in kind of what we call hardware cloth, just to keep the wildlife from messing with them, because that does happen, unfortunately, quite often. Um, So you can grow these as a nice flower border. You can even grow these in containers, just to have a nice spring color splash. You know, they make great cut flowers, of course. But just like I said, just know if you're going to be having tulips, um, that usually after the first 2 years or so, they are going to their quality is going to decrease. So. So I always like whenever I have a class that involves tulips, I always love to give a little bit of history on tulips. And so I feel like we have to mention tulip mania, which is something you all may have heard of even in your history books. And so in 17th century Holland, um, supposedly there was kind of this frenzy over the sale of tulip bulbs. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background information, um, you know, initially tulips were just prized by, gardeners and kind of more stately, more wealthy people. And so they would, kind of eye newer varieties or, species, and they would grow them. But, you know, they became more popular that even kind of your more middle class, families actually started to demand tulips. There was a demand for them. They wanted to, again, get the latest and greatest when it came to different colored varieties. And so, as this happened, and even trading tulips as part of things like dowries, which is just crazy to think about, with a single plant bulb, um, or even kind of mortgaging your home in your estates where the bulbs could be bought for resale at higher prices. I mean, these are the kind of things that were happening, and so um, it came to a point where the prices kept skyrocketing to the point where the market just crashed. And it crashed when there were kind of these doubts as to whether the prices were going to continue to increase. And so the pricing for the tulips collapsed, and that basically caused financial ruin for so many middle and upper class, Dutch families. And so, it's crazy because we think of like economic crisis, and we never think of something like a simple plant bulb causing that, but that was the case. Um, and I'll say kind of some of the main reasons behind this too. Also, if we kind of lump all this together, is there was a particular tulip as well that was kind of that was sought after. And that's the one that you kind of see in the pictures here. It had this beautiful striping, kind of this bicolored appearance. Um, and people sought after this tulip because it was just so unique and so beautiful. But they did not realize, at least initially, that was what was actually causing this color change on this tulip, was a virus. So it was called a tulip breaking virus. And unfortunately, even though this was a beautiful flower, it really hurt the overall health of the tulip, that eventually the tulip would succumb to the virus and die. And so then you're like spending all your money on this tulip only to watch it then just die completely. And so that was definitely very unfortunate as part of this kind of madness, if you will, for wanting to have tulips. Um, I can tell you for the most part, the tulips that we see nowadays that have this kind of a unique coloration is actually more from breeding now, from hybridization and not from a virus. So that may put your mind a little bit more at ease if you want to buy a tulip that looks very similar, is that most of the time it's probably not a virus. It's probably because it was hybridized that way. But of course, if you have an ailing tulip and you're not sure what's going on with it, either send me pictures or bring it by the office. But yeah, so that's just kind of a short history of tulip mania. So we're going to end the presentation on this other native plant. You know, I definitely like to talk about kind of more Kentucky natives um, in um, in our classes. And so this one is called the yellow trout lily, which those of you who have hiked our different Kentucky woodlands may have seen these blooming in the spring, and boy, are they a real treat whenever you see them. They are what we call an ephemeral, meaning that they are going to basically both vegetatively and reproductively grow in the spring. And then once they have flowered, set seed, then they die. They kind of go back into dormancy until the following year. Um, and so you can easily miss these if you're not out and about early on in the season. Um, so there's about two reasons why it's called a yellow trout lily. One, for the most part, which is kind of more thought of, is that the foliage on this, which is very beautiful foliage, has kind of this mottled appearance where it's kind of this pale green with this purplish brown mottling, kind of resembling the coloration of a trout moving through water. So that could be kind of where its name comes from, as well as though the flowers, it produces these little bell-shaped flowers. The general shape of the petals kind of resemble that of a trout fish as well. So just kind of an interesting thing to note about its name. Um, but when it comes to this plant with the foliage, mature plants, flowering plants are going to have two leaves. Immature plants are only going to have one leaf. And so if you only see one leaf, then that plant is not going to be flowering that year. It may only flower, it may flower next year or the year after when it matures. And sometimes it can take these plants, you know, 5 years or so or more to fully mature. But when they do have those two leaves, they are ready to produce flowers. And those flowers are kind of these more nodding, yellow bell-shaped flowers. And those petals may curve backward at the tip as well, although not quite to the extreme that we see with our Turk's cap lily. Sometimes you may see little colonies of this found in the woods. Other times you may just kind of see a random solitary one here or there. But other than just its beauty, um, this is an important plant for our ecosystem. So these produce the Andrena minor bees, which are present across the US, and they're important with the pollination of different woodland and garden species of plants. Um, and so it's good to have these still in our native woodlands and keeping them preserved because they help to support our different insect populations. Now, with that said, I've said this plenty of times in other talks. Please don't dig any of these up. Leave them where they are. You know, there are other ways that you can, you know, purchase trout lilies or kind of the more bulbs without having to poach. And so if you see these in the woodlands, leave them in the woodlands if they're happy in their present environment. So that's important to note. But these, again, are a real treat to have to see if you're going on a hike in the woods of Kentucky. So with that, again, like I said, this is going to be a shorter presentation today than before. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, and I'm going to talk about kind of more of our upcoming classes. So let me go ahead and